We think of medicine as this purely good thing, right? A force for healing. But what if I told you that back in the 19th century, it was also one of the sharpest, most effective tools of empire? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on how healing was turned into a weapon.
So you've almost certainly heard this phrase, the white man's burden. It was the perfect marketing slogan for imperialism. It spun this story that conquest wasn't about greed or power, but was actually a noble, selfless duty. And what was their star exhibit? The #1 proof of this so-called benevolent mission? You guessed it, medicine.
Okay, so let's dig into this whole civilizing mission idea. European powers basically sold their invasions as a grand project of progress. They'd say, look, we're bringing you science, we're bringing you education. But the real trump card was always modern medicine. It was held up as the ultimate proof of their superiority and their goodwill.
And this slide, well, it just lays it all out, doesn't it? The story they told was all about compassion and healing. But the reality? It was a cover story, a really, really good one. Medicine gave them the perfect moral justification for what was, at its core, all about money and political control.
It's also super important to remember that their medicine wasn't what we think of today. You had this brand new revolutionary germ theory just starting to bubble up. But at the same time, a lot of very smart people still believed in miasma theory, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air. So the policies they put in place were often this kind of weird mix of cutting-edge science and honestly old superstitions.
Right, so with all that in mind, let's peel back that first layer of the onion. Who was all this wonderful, benevolent medicine really for, especially in the beginning? Well, the answer couldn't be simpler. It was for them, the colonizers themselves. For Europeans showing up in these places, it was absolutely terrifying. They didn't call parts of West Africa the white man's grave for nothing. Diseases we've now controlled, like malaria and yellow fever, were wiping them out. And you can't really run an empire if all your administrators, soldiers, and merchants are dropping like flies, can you?
So, let's just toss out any idea of a grand humanitarian project, at least for now. The first move was pure, simple pragmatism. Priority number 1, 2, and 3 was to keep the Europeans alive. Because if you can't do that, the whole imperial machine just grinds to a halt.
And if you just look at what they did, their priorities become so obvious. Quinine, that amazing anti-malarial drug, became as vital as guns and ammunition. When they built sanitation projects, where do you think they built them first? Around the military bases and in the European neighborhoods. Clean water, straight to the administrators' houses. Every single move was about creating a safe little bubble for the colonizers to live and work in.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. Once they had figured out how to keep themselves alive, the role of medicine started to change. It went from being a protective shield for them to a weapon of control over everyone else. And you can see exactly how this system was built, piece by piece. First up, you've got things like compulsory vaccinations. In French Algeria, sure, it was about smallpox, but it was also a very public way of showing who was in charge. Then, you get these really intrusive sanitation rules, which gave officials the perfect excuse to inspect people's homes and control their daily lives. And finally, they used hygiene as the reason to design entire cities with separate European and native areas, literally building a racial hierarchy right into the map. And this separation went right through the doors of the hospital. We're talking separate wards, different doctors, and totally different standards of care, all happening under the same roof. So medicine wasn't just reflecting the power structure of the empire, it was actively building and reinforcing it, one patient at a time.
But it goes even deeper still. It's not just that the empire used the medicine that was available. Nope, it actually started to change the direction of science itself. It basically invented a whole new field of medicine just to solve its own problems. And that new field was called tropical medicine. I mean, just stop and think about that name for a second. The whole point wasn't just to study diseases in warm climates, it was specifically designed to solve the medical problems that were getting in the way of running an empire smoothly.
And boy, did this happen fast. It is absolutely no coincidence that the world's very first schools of tropical medicine pop up in Liverpool and London, right at the absolute height of the British Empire. This wasn't some slow, organic academic process. This was a direct, targeted investment. Science was now officially a state-sponsored tool of empire.
And as you can probably guess, this new science had a really dark side. Research often treated colonized people less like patients who needed healing and more like, well, like subjects for experiments. It created scientific reports that just reinforced racist ideas, linking diseases to specific races. And all the while, thousands of years of local, indigenous healing knowledge were just brushed aside as primitive and pushed down.
Now, it would be a huge mistake to think that the local populations were just passive victims in all this. They absolutely were not. They pushed back, they found clever ways to adapt, and they figured out how to navigate this completely new and often hostile reality.
And their responses were all over the map. Yeah, some people would literally hide from the vaccination teams or just refuse to go to a colonial hospital. But a lot of people were incredibly pragmatic. They'd use a Western doctor for a broken bone, but see a traditional healer for a spiritual ailment. They created their own systems, picking and choosing what worked for them. They had agency.
And please, don't think for a second that this is all just dusty old history. The power dynamics that were set up back then are baked into the world we live in today. You can still see the echoes of it in how global health organizations are run, who gets to set the priorities, and even in the subtle ways we talk about health in so-called developing countries.
So what's the big takeaway here? Medicine wasn't just a side story in the Age of Empire, it was a main character. It was a tool for justification, a tool for survival, and a tool for control. And that leaves us with a really important question for today. How are the power dynamics forged by imperial medicine still deciding who gets to be healthy and who doesn't in our world right now?